These root tips were bright green when this orchid went into its new pot. The bark was fresh, the pot was clean, and the plant looked completely fine. But only a few days later, several of those new tips had darkened and stopped pushing forward. The leaves still looked normal, so the problem was easy to miss. What changed? In many cases, the repotting itself is only part of the story. What happens after the orchid is back in the pot can matter just as much. And the surprising part is that some of the things that cause trouble look exactly like good orchid care. Today, I want to walk you through 7 after-repotting mistakes that can damage new roots, explain why they happen, and show you what to do instead. I'll also compare 2 freshly repotted Phalaenopsis orchids along the way, so you can hear how a stable root environment differs from one that keeps changing. Then, at the end, I'll give you a simple 14-day framework for what to watch, what to leave alone, and when your orchid actually needs you to step in. Before we get into the list, one distinction matters. A darkened root tip does not automatically mean the entire root is rotten or dead. A root can stop growing because the tip was bruised, scraped, dried too hard, or otherwise stressed, while the section behind it may remain firm and functional. True root rot is usually a different picture. Tissue becomes brown or black, soft, hollow, or mushy, and the velamen can slip away from the inner root. So throughout this video, I am not asking you to panic every time one tip changes color. I am asking you to look for patterns. Is the root still firm? Is the damage spreading? Are several new tips stopping at the same time? Is the pot staying wet much longer than expected? Those questions tell you far more than color alone. Let's start with the first mistake, because it is made before the first piece of fresh bark even settles around the roots. That mistake is choosing a pot that is too large. A bigger pot can feel like a generous choice. The orchid has room to grow. There is space for future roots, and the plant may even look more balanced above the rim. But orchids are not repotted by matching the pot to the size of the leaves or flowers. The root system is what matters. A small root mass sitting in a large volume of bark creates a very different moisture environment from the one the plant had before. The outer bark may dry quickly, while the center stays damp much longer. That makes it harder to judge when the plant really needs water. It also means the roots can spend more time surrounded by moisture than you realize, even if the surface looks dry. The problem is not that orchids somehow hate large pots. The problem is that extra media changes how water moves, how quickly the center dries, and how much air reaches the roots. If the root system fits comfortably in a smaller, clear pot, giving it a much larger one usually adds media the plant does not yet need. There is also a practical reason clear pots work so well for beginners after repotting. They turn the root zone into something you can monitor from the outside. You can see whether the media is still dark and damp, whether roots are pressed against the wall of the pot, and whether new tips are continuing to extend. That reduces the temptation to unpot the plant, just to satisfy curiosity. Clear pots are not magic, and an opaque pot can still grow a healthy orchid. But when you are learning a new watering rhythm, visibility gives you useful information. Whatever pot you use, make sure it has effective drainage. Decorative outer pots can look beautiful, but if they trap runoff around the inner pot, the root zone can remain wetter than you think. Think about our 2 orchids. Orchid A has a root mass that fills most of its pot without being crushed. There is fresh bark around the roots, but there is not a huge unused reservoir of media. Orchid B has a similar root mass, but it was placed in a much larger pot because the grower wanted to avoid repotting again for a long time. From the top, both plants may look equally tidy, but underneath, the drying pattern can be very different. Orchid A is easier to read. Orchid B has more bark, a wetter center, and a greater chance that the grower will make decisions based only on the dry-looking surface. This is why pot size affects more than appearance. It affects every watering decision that comes afterward. And once a grower notices the plant wobbling in that larger pot, the next instinct is often to add more bark and press it down hard. That leads directly to mistake number 2. Mistake number 2 is packing the bark too tightly. Fresh bark should support the root system and fill the pot without leaving huge empty pockets. But it should not be compressed into a dense block. Phalaenopsis roots are adapted to an airy environment. They need moisture, but they also need oxygen around them. If bark is forced tightly into every space and pushed down aggressively, the root zone can lose some of the open structure that makes orchid bark useful in the first place. Drainage can slow, drying can become less even, and the grower may create exactly the kind of wet, low air center that they were trying to avoid by choosing bark. The reason this happens is understandable. A newly repotted orchid often feels loose. The old media may have held the plant in place, and the fresh bark has not settled yet. So the grower pushes harder and adds more media until the orchid feels fixed. But stability and compression are not the same thing. A better goal is this: secure the orchid, not the entire root zone. Let the bark settle naturally around the roots. Tap the pot gently if needed so pieces fall into open spaces, but do not crush the media down until it behaves like packed soil. If the plant still moves, solve the movement directly. A stake, a rhizome clip where appropriate, or a careful arrangement of the roots and pot can stabilize the plant without turning the bark into a solid mass. This is important because mistake number 3 is the opposite problem, leaving the orchid so loose that the entire plant rocks every time the pot is moved. New root tips are tender. They can be damaged by repeated rubbing against bark, especially when the plant base shifts back and forth. So the goal is not a loose plant in loose media. The goal is an airy root zone with a stable plant. Mistake number 3 is allowing the orchid to wobble after repotting. A Phalaenopsis does not need to be locked in place like concrete, but it should not swing at the base every time you touch the pot. Imagine a new root tip beginning to extend into fresh bark. That tip is soft, active tissue. If the crown and stems shift repeatedly, the root can scrape against the media again and again. Even small, repeated movement can interrupt a root that was trying to establish itself. This is especially common when an orchid has lost many roots and the remaining root mass is too small to anchor the plant by itself. The grower may notice the movement, push the plant down deeper, pack more bark, or repeatedly reposition it. Each fix can create a new problem if the real issue is simply that the plant needs external support. This is where Orchid A and Orchid B begin to separate. Orchid A is stable at the base. The bark is not packed hard, but the plant does not rock. Orchid B is still loose. Each time the grower waters, turns the pot, or checks the roots, the plant shifts. That movement changes how the roots sit in the bark. It also changes the contact between roots and media, which can make moisture behavior less predictable. If your orchid is wobbling, fix the movement without burying the crown, without forcing the plant too deep into the pot, and without turning the bark into a compressed plug. A stable plant gives new roots a better chance to grow into the new environment without repeated mechanical stress. And once the plant is stable, the next big question becomes water, because even 2 orchids in similar pots can experience completely different root conditions after the same watering. Mistake number 4 is watering the new root zone as if nothing changed. This is one of the most important after repotting mistakes, because it is easy to follow an old routine when the root environment is no longer the same. Maybe you watered every 7 days before. Maybe you soaked the pot whenever the roots looked silver. Maybe you watered when the top bark felt dry. Those habits may have worked in the old pot, but after repotting, several things may have changed at once. The amount of healthy root tissue may be smaller because dead or rotten roots were removed. The pot size may be different. The bark may be fresh and behave differently from old, decomposed media. If you move from moss to bark, or from bark to a bark and moss mix, water retention may be very different. Airflow around the pot may also change if you change the container or the location. So your old watering schedule may be measuring an environment that no longer exists. This is why I do not like a single rigid rule, such as always water immediately, or always wait several days for every repotted orchid. The safer approach is to look at the actual situation. Was the plant heavily disturbed? Were many roots cut? Is the bark dry or pre-moistened? Is the pot small and airy or large and moisture retentive? Is the room warm and dry or cool and humid? Is there good airflow? These factors change how quickly the root zone dries. What matters most is avoiding the 2 extremes. keeping damaged roots continuously soggy, or leaving a plant with limited roots so dry for so long that it cannot maintain itself. The goal is not to obey the calendar. The goal is to learn how this new pot behaves. Fresh bark also deserves a closer look because it can confuse people in both directions. Some bark initially sheds water and dries quickly near the surface, which can make a grower think the orchid needs another drink almost immediately. Other mixes include finer material or sphagnum that holds moisture much longer in the center. Older bark behaves differently again because as it breaks down, particles become smaller, air spaces shrink, and moisture can remain around the roots for longer. That means a plant moved from old media into fresh media may need a new watering rhythm, even if the pot size stays exactly the same. Do not assume the word bark describes one predictable moisture pattern. The grade of the bark, the amount of moss, the pot ventilation, and your home environment all matter. A clear pot is extremely useful here because it lets you observe without pulling the orchid out. Look at the roots you can actually see. Healthy Phalaenopsis roots may appear greener when wet and more silvery as they dry, but root color should not be your only signal. Look at the bark too. Is there visible moisture deep in the pot? Is the center darker than the top? Does the pot feel noticeably lighter than it did after watering? Is there condensation trapped inside for a long time, or does it clear as the pot dries? Use several clues together. A dry-looking top layer does not automatically mean the center is dry. That is especially important in an oversized pot, where the middle may stay damp long after the surface looks ready for water. Now, think again about our two orchids. Orchid A is in a pot close to the size of its root system, with airy bark and a stable base. The grower can see most of the root zone and learns how quickly the pot gets lighter. Orchid B is in more media, some of it packed tightly, and the plant still shifts. If both orchids receive the same volume of water on the same schedule, that does not mean the roots experience the same conditions. Orchid B may stay wet much longer in the center. This is why watering is not just about how much water you pour. It is about how long the root zone stays wet, how much air remains around the roots, and how quickly the environment returns to an airy state. There is another part of watering that beginners sometimes overlook after repotting: the crown. When you water a Phalaenopsis, do not leave water sitting in the crown or trapped between leaves for long periods. The crown is the growing center of the plant, and stagnant water there can create a different kind of problem from root stress. Water the root zone thoroughly when the plant actually needs it. Let excess water drain freely and keep the crown from staying wet. Good drainage matters because a clear plastic pot inside a decorative cash pot can easily trap runoff if you forget to empty it. A perfectly chosen bark mix cannot protect roots that are left standing in water. The other extreme is reacting to every slightly silver root by watering again immediately. After repotting, some visible roots may dry faster than others. Aerial roots can look different from roots buried in the pot. The roots near the wall of a clear container may change color before the center has dried. This is why the whole root zone matters. Use the pot weight, visible media, root condition, room temperature, humidity, and airflow together. Over the first week, your job is partly to learn this new pattern. Once you understand how the fresh media behaves in your home, watering becomes much easier. And when growers see a root slow down during that adjustment period, the next reaction is often to feed it. That brings us to mistake number 5. Mistake number 5 is pushing fertilizer before the orchid has begun to settle. Fertilizer is useful when a plant is actively growing and able to use nutrients. But fertilizer is not first aid for repotting stress. If the root system has been heavily disturbed, if many roots were removed, or if the remaining roots are already damaged, stronger feeding does not repair them. In fact, a concentrated fertilizer solution can add another source of stress, especially around tender new root tips. Orchid roots can be sensitive to salt buildup, and fresh, active tips are exactly the tissue you are trying to protect. So the idea that more fertilizer means faster recovery can work against the goal. This does not mean fertilizer becomes forbidden the moment an orchid is repotted. The better question is whether the plant has begun to establish, and whether the roots are healthy enough to return to the normal feeding routine. If the orchid was repotted with minimal root disturbance and is actively growing, it may transition back more easily. If the plant had severe root loss, soft or rotting roots, or significant stress, the priority should be stable moisture, airflow, light, and time. Do not try to force growth with a stronger dose. If you resume feeding, use the normal diluted approach appropriate for orchids rather than trying to compensate for stress. And if salts have already accumulated, flushing with plain water during appropriate watering can help prevent additional buildup. One more point about fertilizer. If you use it, more frequent weak feeding is not an excuse to ignore salt accumulation. Minerals from fertilizer and hard water can build up on bark and around roots over time. If you see heavy crusting on the pot or media, that is a sign to review both water quality and feeding strength. A newly repotted orchid with tender root tips does not benefit from an aggressive dose meant to catch up for nutrients it missed. Recovery is driven first by functioning roots, suitable moisture, light, and temperature. Nutrition supports that process only when the plant is in a condition to use it. This is the midpoint lesson I want you to remember. More care is not always more support. A nervous grower often responds to a freshly repotted orchid by doing more of everything. More water, more fertilizer, more moving, more checking, but the plant may not need more activity around it. It may need a stable environment and enough time for the roots to respond. That becomes especially important when the leaves still look perfectly normal, because the next mistake often happens simply because the plant appears strong enough to go straight back into harsh light and heat. Mistake number 6 is placing a freshly disturbed orchid directly into strong sun or a much hotter position. Phalaenopsis orchids generally prefer bright, indirect light rather than intense direct midday or afternoon sun through glass. After repotting, especially when the root system has been reduced or heavily handled, adding sudden heat and intense light can increase stress at the same time the plant is trying to establish its roots. The leaves can lose water faster, while the roots are temporarily less efficient at replacing it. This does not mean the orchid should be hidden in a dark corner. Deep shade is not the goal. The goal is stable, appropriate light, without a sudden jump in heat or direct sun exposure. A bright window with filtered light can be excellent, depending on the direction of the window, the season, and how strong the sun is in your home. A sheer curtain can soften intense light. The simplest rule after repotting is to avoid stacking new stresses on top of each other. If the orchid was already doing well in a particular bright, indirect location, do not suddenly move it to the hottest windowsill because you think extra light will speed recovery. Likewise, do not keep carrying the plant from place to place trying to find the perfect spot. Every location changes temperature, airflow, and drying speed. Stability matters here too. This is also why the two orchid comparison is useful. Orchid A stays in a consistent location with suitable indirect light and predictable airflow. Orchid B keeps moving. First it is near a bright window, then farther back because the leaves feel warm, then closer again because the grower worries it is not getting enough light. Each move changes how fast the pot dries. Then the watering decision changes too. Soon it becomes difficult to tell whether the orchid is reacting to the repot, the light, the temperature, the water, or all of them together. The lesson is not to ignore the plant. The lesson is to change one thing only when the plant gives you a reason. And that urge to make one more adjustment leads directly to mistake number 7. Mistake number 7 is pulling the orchid out of the pot again and again to inspect the roots. This is one of the most understandable mistakes because the roots are the part you are worried about. If a tip looks darker, you want to know what is happening deeper in the pot. If the plant feels loose, you want to check whether a root broke. If a leaf softens slightly, you may want to confirm that the roots are still alive. But every time you remove the orchid, the root zone is disturbed again. Bark shifts. Root to media contact changes. Tender tips can be scraped. The plant has to be repositioned, and the stability you were trying to build gets reset. Observation is useful. Repeated disturbance is not observation. A clear pot allows you to learn a lot without removing the plant. Look for firm roots, instead of obsessing over one isolated color change. Watch whether damage is spreading or staying localized. Check whether the plant is stable at the base. Feel the pot weight before and after watering so you learn the difference. Watch how long the media stays visibly moist. Notice whether drainage is fast or slow. Smell the pot if you suspect decomposing media or stagnant conditions. Watch the leaves over time rather than reacting to a single hour of softness. One small change does not always require immediate intervention. There are times when you should take action. If you see spreading rot, a foul smell, a pot that remains waterlogged, rapidly worsening tissue, or a plant that is clearly unstable because the original repot was not secure, then the root zone may need to be corrected. But if the orchid is stable, the media is drying in a reasonable pattern, the visible roots remain firm, and there is no expanding damage, constantly taking it apart can create more stress than information. The hardest skill after repotting is often knowing when to stop touching the plant. You did the work, now give the roots a chance to respond. So what should you actually do during the first 2 weeks after repotting? Think of the next 14 days as a framework for observation, not a countdown to recovery. The orchid does not know that day 14 is supposed to mean anything. Some plants settle quickly, some take longer, and some have been stressed before repotting even begins. The calendar is there to organize your attention. The orchid decides the pace. During the first 3 days, focus on stability. Make sure the plant is secure without being buried too deeply. Check that the pot drains freely and is not sitting in runoff. Keep the orchid in bright, indirect light, with no sudden blast of direct sun or unusual heat. Do not keep moving it around. If the roots were heavily handled or cut, pay close attention to the actual moisture in the pot before watering again, rather than following the old schedule automatically. Keep water from remaining in the crown. Most important, resist the urge to stimulate recovery with extra fertilizer, repeated soaking, or constant inspection. During these first days, doing less can be a very active form of good care because you are protecting stability. From roughly day 4 through day 7, start learning the new pot. This is where observation becomes more useful than intervention. Compare the weight of the pot when it is freshly watered with the weight as it dries. Look through the clear sides and notice whether the bark in the center stays darker than the bark near the top. Watch visible roots for firmness and normal wet to dry color changes. Check that the base of the plant is still stable. If the bark settled slightly after watering, that is not automatically a reason to push more media in aggressively. Ask whether the roots are actually exposed in a way that creates a problem, or whether the pot simply looks less perfect than it did on repotting day. This is also the period when you may discover that your old watering interval no longer fits. Maybe the fresh bark dries faster than the old decomposed media. Maybe a little sphagnum in the mix keeps the center damp longer. Maybe the smaller root system uses water more slowly. Do not force the new pot to match the old calendar. Let the drying pattern teach you. When the root zone is ready for water, water thoroughly enough to wet the media, allow it to drain completely, and then wait for the appropriate drying cycle again. The goal is not constant dampness and not prolonged drought. The goal is a repeatable, wet-to-dry rhythm that fits this plant, this pot, and your home. From about day 8 through day 14, watch for stability rather than demanding visible growth. A healthy response may be as simple as the plant remaining firm in the pot, existing roots staying firm, no new areas of rot appearing, leaves maintaining reasonable firmness, and the media developing a predictable drying pattern. If the orchid is already in active growth, you may see a root tip continue extending or a new root begin, but do not use that as a deadline. No new root on day 14 does not automatically mean the repot failed. Plants move at different speeds, and environmental conditions matter. This is also when you can think about returning gradually to your normal feeding routine, but use the plant as the guide. If roots are healthy, the orchid is stable, the media is behaving normally, and the plant is actively growing, a diluted orchid fertilizer routine may be appropriate again. If the plant is still dealing with significant root damage, ongoing rot, or severe dehydration, Do not try to force progress with stronger fertilizer. Fix the root environment first. Fertilizer supports growth. It does not replace functioning roots. By the end of these 2 weeks, the most useful question is not, has my orchid fully recovered? The better question is, do I understand what this new root environment is doing? Do you know how quickly the pot dries? Do you know whether the plant is stable? Do you know which visible roots are firm? Do you know whether light and temperature are consistent? Do you know when the orchid actually needs water instead of when the old calendar says it should get water? If the answer to those questions is yes, you are in a much better position to care for the plant going forward. Now come back to our 2 orchids. The important difference is not that one received a secret treatment. Orchid A was given a pot that fit the roots, airy media, a stable base, appropriate light, and enough time for the new environment to become predictable. Orchid B kept getting new variables. Extra media, more compression, more movement, watering based on the old routine, early feeding, location changes, and repeated inspections. The lesson is simple. A fresh pot does not need constant attention. It needs the right conditions and enough stability for the roots to respond. If you remember only one line from this video, make it this: stability first, observation second, intervention only when necessary. Choose the pot for the roots you actually have. Keep the media airy. Learn how the new pot dries. Protect the plant from unnecessary heat, movement, and repeated disturbance. Then let the roots show you what they need next. Thanks for watching. If this helped you understand what happens after repotting, subscribe for more practical orchid care, and let me know in the comments which of these 7 mistakes you have made before. And if you know another orchid grower who is about to repot, share this with them before those new roots go into their new home.